Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another Kepler Live. Today, I am welcoming Lori Miller, one of our both speech and mathematics teachers. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So the logo you guys saw just a moment ago is the logo for the Leonberg Prize for Excellence in Rhetoric, the 2020 inaugural edition. And that prize, which will be given for to the best competitive speech delivered after your current summer competitive speech is over. That's coming right up. So maybe you can talk a little bit. It's too late for new students to come in and register for that class to win the award, but I think it's a great example of some of the stuff that's going on at Kepler. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your competitive speech class, your background in competitive speech, and of course the prize.
Okay. Well, as far as a background in competitive speech, our family has been competing in competitive speech and debate for 10 seasons now. And so one thing about competitive speech and debate in the Christian leagues is that parents have to participate or the tournaments don't happen. And so we've gotten heavily involved. My husband is on the tabulation team. He helps to tabulate the results and put out new ballots and make sure that the awards get properly assigned at the end and all of that. And I am the logistics coordinator for Region 3 for the NCFCA, and I love it. I make sure that every tournament has everything it needs to run, everything from awards to paper clips to name tags to candy, anything that's not judge hospitality food and not affiliate food. So
that's you. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I do, and I love it. We've had 2 boys go through, and our last one just graduated. Makes me very sad. We're gonna miss it so much. Although Keith and I, my husband and I, are going to continue because we don't have anyone to take over our jobs yet. So we promised that we're going to hang in there for 1 more year at least. And I just love it. We just love speech and debate. The reason I love competitive speech and debate is I love what it does for the kids. My students, our students, I have watched them grow. There's one young lady I can think of in particular who, when she started at age 12, she would cry after every speech that she gave. And by the time she graduated, she was in the national competition and right up toward the top in her speech categories, close to winning the national tournaments and poised. She could speak about what was important to her and be able to craft a speech and be able to tell people why our faith matters and be able to give a reason, as scripture says, for the hope that we have. So I just, speech club is wonderful, speech classes are wonderful, but it's not until they get into the competition that they really grow. It's in competition that they really grow.
Well, you know, apologetics is wonderful, and knowing the right arguments is wonderful as well. But you know, being in that pressure situation where you have to, that's, and you know, it's one of the tensions. I think, you know, every parent experiences it, but it's a particular thing that homeschooling parents need to be very conscious of, is that, you know, putting your children in situations where they will in fact grow, right? You have to see them sometimes suffer. You have to see your 12-year-old cry so that as a 17-year-old you can excel, and that's very difficult. Like I actually had, you know, it's so funny too when you see, you know, in teaching online classes and, you know, kind of mix of homeschoolers, and you know, it's a mix, and you can kind of tell the kids have never been in a class before, and there's a deer in the headlights sort of thing. I made my own son cry in a Spanish class because I asked him a question in front of everybody. And he had never had that happen to him, you know. I know. All that to say, like, it's worth it. You know, to put it out there, and you know, they grow through the fire, as it were.
Yeah.
Take a step back, maybe because competitive speech is a thing, and there are tournaments. But what is the thing? What's competitive speech? What does it look like?
The class or the activity?
Sorry, the activity.
Okay, the activity, competitive speech and debate. Can't forget the debate. In fact, my son would rather it be competitive debate and speech. Let's put priorities here. There are two leagues, two Christian homeschool leagues. Well, they're not. NCFCA is no longer just a homeschool league. It started as that, but it's now for Christian students, no matter how they're educated. I would say the vast majority are still homeschoolers. But there are 10 or 11 different speech events. The students can pick up to 5 different speeches, 5 different speech categories to participate in. They can compete in one style of debate per tournament, or at a national level tournament, they can actually compete in 2. The national level tournaments include moot court, as well as Lincoln Douglas debate and team policy debate. So they can pick either team policy or Lincoln Douglas, and then they can also compete in moot court. So people from, I don't know where to start. NCFCA has 10 regions, and so each region has its own tournaments, but then there are also national level tournaments that anybody from across the nation can come to and compete at that kind of a level. So our region, Region 3, is fairly small. We will have up to maybe 40 kids in a tournament that are competing, but it is a full tournament. You'll have 6, each speech is given 3 times in the preliminary rounds, and then it depends on the number of students, but there will be often be semifinals and finals. In debate, you have 6 preliminary rounds, and then it depends on how many competitors there are as to how many out rounds, elimination rounds there will be.
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense. I remember watching the spelling bees on ESPN, and it's that I can imagine that sort of level of heightened feeling. So with the Leonberg Prize that we're offering at the end of the summer term, it's probably not fair to say we're having a tournament. We're having an event with a few competitors, but it is following some of the rules that you're familiar with in your background with competitive speech.
Yes, the students will have to submit a script like they do in an NCFCA or a STOA tournament. They'll have to submit a script and have it checked. And part of that is just to make sure that they're following the rules. We want them to learn that they have to give credit where credit is due. No plagiarism. We don't want them to learn to plagiarize. We want them to say, yes, I got this material from, I don't know, Joe Schmedley somewhere, We want them to be able to say that. So that's one of the reasons for the script. The other is just it teaches them to cross their T's and dot their I's, and
for sure,
which is also important. So
I know you're passionate about competitive speech. You're also a math teacher, and in fact, you're offering 3 math classes.
I am, yes.
Yeah. So, but before we get into that, I'd actually love to just kind of to get to know you better, and for our family to be able to get to know you. You've been with Wickliffe for many years, so maybe you could talk a bit about you and your family's Wickliffe Life.
Okay, yeah. My husband and I have been with Wickliffe since 1991, so 29 years we've been with Wickliffe. And we started off thinking that we were going to be translators. We headed that direction. We took 2 semesters of translation preparation, and then we got to Africa. We did an orientation course, and during that orientation course we took what do they call it, a career assessment, like a personality and career assessment type of a thing. And they looked at us and said, you put this couple in a traditional translation assignment and you will lose them. The traditional translation assignments are no longer really very traditional. They're more the people that, they're more team leaders now. They gather the people that will do the translations, the national translation teams, and they're the people that will identify those people that are gifted in their own language, and they'll identify people that can help teach people how to read, and they make sure the funding's in place, and they do all these various things. And they looked at especially my husband's profile and said, no, he needs to be a specialist. So I'll make a long story short there, he ended up transitioning into IT support and has worked in IT support ever since for Wickliffe. So he's now the platform administrator for an online training system, which helps to train translators and do various other training tasks around the world. So, yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I mean, I love the work Wickliffe does, and I think it's an honor for us to have a long-time Wickliffe family with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about these math classes. You start off your course descriptions at the beginning of each one with a quote, and the quote for your geometry course, you have a couple. And one of them is straight up the words of Johannes Kepler, the person we're named after.
I know, I like that.
Yeah, perfect. So we chose to be named Kepler because we're classical, we're Christian, and we don't want to forget STEM. We want to give science and math the full plenary participation in classical education that it ought to have. And so, here you are, a math teacher who loves words. And so the quote from Kepler is, "We glorify God by learning of him and his world. To learn is an act of," oh no, sorry, that's the wrong quote. "The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics."
Yes.
And then you said learning mathematics is a powerful way to worship God. Maybe you could open that up for us a bit.
Well, when I look at mathematics, I am amazed at the order that's there and how it reveals the character of God to us. It's fascinating to me how all these little things fit together in mathematics, and it's beautiful to me. I know that a lot of my students would probably say that's not real beautiful, Mrs. Miller, but it is. It's gorgeous to see. If you look at I'm sorry, words are escaping me now. The spiral.
The Fibonacci sequence?
Yes, exactly. The Fibonacci sequence. And how beautiful that is, and how far you see it in creation. I mean, it's in so many different places. Or you see the golden ratio, yes, and you see it reflected throughout creation. There's so many things that God has shown his purpose, his order, who he is in the world around us. I think for me, it's part of general revelation. And maybe that's part of it is I love God's word and I love his special revelation, but mathematics shows his general revelation.
Yeah. So, that particular quote was in a geometry class. You're teaching geometry, pre-algebra and algebra 1. So this may be too obscure a question, but I think it just kind of more reveals my own imagination. But when you say those things, and I think of geometry, that's an instant connection for me, right? I see exactly how God reveals himself in geometry. How does God reveal himself in other maths, in algebra, in calculus? Is it more arcane? Do I need to attune my ears better?
Well, maybe it's just, I don't know, order is a lot of it. When I got into calculus, when I was studying for my master's, I was amazed at the order in calculus and how you can go to the derivatives and it shows one thing, and you go to the, now see, words are escaping me again. This is really bad. I'm showing my age. But you go the other direction.
You were just talking about competitive speech. It's a bad moment for words.
This is terrible. Well, I tell my kids that I can teach the theory of how to do it impromptu, but trying to get up and actually do it is a lot harder than teaching the theory of how to do it. So, I was just amazed at the order of it, how it shows one level will show this, and the next level will show this about a concept, and the next level will show this. And it's just, it's fascinating to see what God has done in there, even with the imaginary numbers. I understand from my brother-in-law, who's an engineer, that imaginary numbers are used in engineering, and they need that kind of thing. I'm like, how can you use? Wouldn't you want real numbers in engineering? I mean, I want my bridges to be built on real facts.
Right.
But they use imaginary numbers to get some of the calculations that they do for the real world. So
I'm as surprised as you were.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we can just kind of run through each class in a sort of a summary fashion. Maybe this is what the course is, and here's why you should take it. And of course, it's when we ask say Algebra 1 teacher, that's not the same thing as asking a music teacher or a how to write a fairy tale teacher take this class, because everyone is more or less required to take pre-algebra at a certain point, right? Still, I'd absolutely love to hear you just kind of give the here's why you should be taking this class. So maybe we just kind of run through the list: pre-algebra, algebra 1, and geometry.
Okay. Pre-algebra is like the preparatory class for all of the high school math classes. It lays the foundation for all of the high school math classes. And that's, since you have to take high school math, it's probably a good one to start. But it lays that foundation of learning, and one of the things of learning to think mathematically, so that when you get into those higher level math classes, you're not just applying, well, I want to do this, so I'm going to apply this formula, but you're learning why. Why do you use that formula? Why wouldn't you use another formula? If you use a formula and you come up with an answer, is it reasonable? Because you need to be able to tell, if you're dividing by a fraction and you end up with a bigger number, it doesn't sound reasonable. But you have to look at, why is that so? I mean, if you're dividing a pie into 8 parts, so you divide 1 by an 8th, you're going to end up with 8, because now there are 8 parts. And just learning to think logically about why that works.
Yeah.
So pre-algebra sets the foundation for both algebra and geometry, really. And then algebra 1, it goes on and it continues with the pre-algebra, with the algebraic thinking, trying to find unknowns. How many times do we try to find unknowns in our lives? Now, I know that most people don't use much algebra. I tend to use it some in my cooking. If I'm trying to go from one, I'm going from, I want to double the recipe, or I want to triple the recipe, or more obscurely, if I have 9/5 of the amount of butter that I want, but I want to use all my butter, and so I want to increase the recipe that much. How do I find that? I'll actually use algebra that way.
Yeah, that's quite an application. I'm an eyeball cook, which means I really am not a good baker, for example. But yeah, I'll have to try that out.
So algebra 1 continues that, builds on it, helps you start to learn to deal with the unknown quantities. I remember when I was learning algebra, I had always been taught that the equal sign meant this is the answer. And when I got into algebra, I learned that the equal sign doesn't mean this is the answer. The equal sign means that the two sides are equal, that there's a balance there. And so that was a real revelation. I still remember my first algebraic equation was x plus 2 equals something. I don't remember, x plus 2 equals 4 or something. And you had to find out what x was. And they said, well, what you want to do is get rid of the 2. And I couldn't understand. I'm like, the 2 is just sitting there. It's not hurting anyone. Why do you want to get rid of the 2? What I didn't understand was what they were saying was you wanted to find out what the equivalent to x was. Where was the balance? X was the equivalent of, and so in that case, you need to find out that x is 2.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, and listening to good math teachers talk about teaching math, I mean, it's the same sort of rationales that, like when I think of teaching language or of writing, where, you are learning to master something. And I think a lot of students approach math as in they have to answer to something. Right. So what you're saying is, no, you're actually learning to use this stuff
Yes.
to show some mastery, and which I think is wonderful.
Yes.
And actually, so I'm going to interrupt your flow because that kind of feeds into a question that we had come in from Sean Bonnet. So he asks, what techniques do you use when teaching abstract concepts? It seems like most students dread math. I don't know about most students, but yeah. So most students dread math because it doesn't make sense. So that's the abstract connection. Now, what techniques do you use when teaching abstract concepts?
Well, you have to relate it to concrete concepts to begin with. They have to start there, because with any learning, you have to start with what they know and go on from there. You have to find out whatever hooks it is that they have and go on from there. So without knowing the specific abstract concept, I'd have a hard time, but I know that I have to start with what do they know and then go on, build on to an abstract concept.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, what about that geometry class?
Geometry is so important because of logic. It teaches if this, then this, and it teaches you to think logically. I'm here. I want to prove why this thing. I mean, because so many principles in geometry, we look at it and we say, of course that makes sense, but why? How can you prove that it makes sense? And so it's a matter of building a proof, of putting in the right pieces along the line so that they can figure out, yes, this does make sense.
Well, you know, I always logic. Sorry.
No, I just said it really is logic.
Yes. Well, you know, I always enjoyed as a youth math class, except for, and I enjoyed geometry, but I didn't enjoy having to prove things, having to write proofs. That frustrated me. I'm not sure what immaturity in me that was expressing, but in college, I took a Euclidean geometry course, and all of that changed. You know, and I think perhaps it might have been more word puzzly, or, but you know, the process itself was a little different. And I know, so your geometry course is including some Euclidean geometry in it, but it's not exclusively Euclidean by any means. So yeah, you know, maybe I'd love to just kind of hear about how you're incorporating Euclidean geometry, and maybe how you might improve my own mindset when I was frustrated with having to write proofs.
Well, I'm right there with you, Joffrey. I really hated writing proofs. I'm not the most logical person at times, and so it was very important for me, and I think it's very important for students. But it's not something that I just adore doing. But I do think it's important. Isn't that the truth, that there are a lot of important things that are just not easy? As far as bringing in Euclid, I looked at a translation of him recently, and I was amazed at how many of the geometrical, is that the right word? I guess the geometry concepts that we use today are like directly from Euclid. It's not like he started the idea and somebody else added to it. And so, I mean, so many of them are right there, that the Euclidean geometry that we teach is right from Euclid. I mean, and that's high school geometry, is Euclidean geometry. So what I want is for the students to look at Euclid and what he said, and then be able to see how that, I just want them to see it reflected in the modern math textbook that we'll be using. Well, textbook math program that we'll be using. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. So pre-algebra, algebra 1, and geometry all on offer for 2020, 2021. Yep. Now, I have this feeling that this question might have come up in a conversation we might have had off air. I don't quite recall, but let's talk about like the joys and utilities of math, right? So what about the student who says, you know, and you already gave your butter measuring example, but what about the student who says, I'm never gonna use this stuff? And I know the answer is already embedded in a lot of the stuff you were talking about, but I'd love to have it kind of explicitly laid out there. What do you say to that student?
Well, you know, I suppose there are some people that will never use it. If you use your hands, though, for anything, you're going to be using math. Mm-hmm. If you build anything with wood, you're going to be using math. If you work on any kind of a craft, you're going to be using math, because you have to, in any kind of activity with your hands, you have to measure, I suppose you could eyeball things, but it depends on how precise you want something. You're going to need to use math. More than that, though, I think everybody uses math just in that it trains your logic. It trains you to think logically, and that's something that you will always use. So.
Yes. So you're saying that we should have been studying a lot more math, say, the last 20 years.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
The world would be a different place.
You know, I could get very, I don't know how much you want to get into that. There actually is a movement these days saying that math is very Western and we shouldn't teach math anymore because it is like of the oppressors, I guess, is one way to think of it. And that makes me very sad because I look at it as it should be from God. It shouldn't be from somebody that thinks he or she is superior. It's a way to see the beauty of God and his creation. It's not.
Yeah. And it may sound like good Mrs. Miller is exaggerating, folks, but no, this is a real thing where, this actual college professors saying, math is a tool of colonizers and of Western oppression, which, speaks to the value not only of studying math, but of having a fully integrated education so that you have, the historical background to be aware of, math is Chinese and is Indian and is African. Like if you just study a little history, math is Persian and math is Russian, math is everyone's.
I know. In fact, one of my assignments is going to be that my students, I guess I just can't get away from speech and debate, but my students are going to need to write a short essay and give a short presentation, one on a mathematical concept and one on a mathematician. And I really do want them to find some of those mathematicians, the Indians and the Chinese, that they may not have ever heard of. I mean, they've heard of Kepler, I hope, especially being part of Kepler.
Right.
But I'd like them to find some of these others that they may never have heard of. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you said, general revelation, right? I mean, this is one more aspect in which God has revealed himself, and it's a language and a tool that we can, is part of our dominion mandate, I think.
Yeah. Well, and thinking about getting away from logic, I love competitive speech and debate, but for the most part, I don't highly recommend it in college, at the college level, because so much of the college speech and debate has become, I mean, there are exceptions to the rule. I know that you could look at Patrick Henry and you could find some good examples of speech and debate there. But there are an awful lot of colleges where it's become just totally illogical. In fact, one recent, I wish I had the exact facts at my fingertips, but a couple of years ago, people that won in a debate won because they just their argument was that we can't know anything logical, and logic is oppressive and Western, and so therefore they win because there's nothing logical, and so the logic of nothing logical is that they win, but they won with it. I mean, it was just totally bizarre. Our son was in speech and debate for a while at the college level, and there were people that would arrive drunk to prove a point in a round.
Wow.
And,
well, it's interesting that your introduction to competitive speech course is, of course, a rhetoric class, but rhetoric, just like everything we study ends up being an integrated thing. To do something like what you just described, part of your thinking has to be that rhetoric is a tool strictly for emotional manipulation.
Yes.
Where the true student of rhetoric must appeal to the emotions.
Yes.
Because he's appealing to the human being.
Yes.
But it ends up, that's what makes, that's why we use rhetoric the word rhetoric in a sinister fashion, because that's how it ends up being used. So basically the greatest demagogue or the greatest cynic is the one who is able to win, instead of appealing positively to all aspects of human interaction with speech. It's sort of dismaying. So I love that you have this rhetoric course, and that it's a rhetoric course that does in fact focus on some pretty technical aspects of rhetoric? Because rhetoric isn't all about fiery pounding of the pulpit. It can include that.
Yeah, no, it's about making eye contact and coming with a nice, concise message. And yeah, I try to tell my kids that unfortunately, it's not truth that always wins out anymore. It's whatever idea is expressed the most eloquently, which is, I'm sure, where we get the wrong idea of the word rhetoric. But I want them to learn to express truth. I pray that none of the kids in my speech classes, this class or in the clubs I've taught, ever use what they've learned to express untruth, or to expound and to further untruth. I want them to speak with truth and grace. That's really
amen. I mean, it's just the Spider-Man principle, right? With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly.
You're handing them these tools. Use them wisely, young man.
Use them wisely, yes.
Well, we've got a couple of questions coming in through our comments. The first is from Scott Postma. I've often heard teachers say learning math is essential to developing sound critical thinking skills. Can you explain how math helps students think correctly?
Well, you don't get the right answer unless you think critically about what the problem is asking and how to apply the right principles. So you have to look at what's being asked and analyze it critically, and then apply the right concepts. It's like a tutorial in critical thinking skills. I'm not sure how else to say it. I feel like I just repeated the question, but
I thought it was pithily said. I mean, sometimes the answer is brief. A question from Joshua Kiefer, going back to speech and rhetoric. What do you think about the rhetoric we encounter in our daily lives from politicians and other talking heads? Look, he's already slanting you in a certain direction by using the pejorative talking heads.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. What do I think about that rhetoric? I think most of it is misdirection, or it's expounding untruth. But I think a lot of it is misdirection. They're not actually into answering a question logically or with truth. What they want to do is point you in a different direction, and so they're using the persuasiveness of their speech to take you in the direction that they want you to go. Most of the rhetoric we hear is unfortunately the false term of the word rhetoric. It's the pejorative term of it, because it's not being used in a way to illuminate the truth, to expand the truth. In fact, most of it is just little sound bites. Yes. I wish that elections were about people actually looking at the issues and thinking logically and critically about them, but they're not. It's a whole bunch of, well, I heard somebody say this and I heard somebody say that, and
and I might even argue that we've because our entire society has changed. It is changing through how it looks at truth and how it communicates truth. And we've already kind of talked about the emotional aspect of things. I actually think we've kind of moved out of an era of sound bites into an era of just catchphrases. Where it's enough because all we need is the emotional appeal. So a certain emotional baggage gets associated with a certain phrase, and you just have to throw that out there to get the desired result. And actually, the use of those things becomes the message itself. Which is dismaying. Scott Postma is shocked to see you claim the absolute truth in the world. Shocked, I tell you.
Yes, there is absolute truth. It's interesting how those people that say there is no absolute truth will say so on one level. Who was it that said that there's like two levels of a house in our culture today, that we tend to think of truth being on one level and like religion and philosophy and everything else on another level. But it's amazing how these people who say there is no absolute truth would be shocked and appalled if you took away the $1,000 that's in their bank account, because to them that's an absolute truth. but if you want to say, well, my truth is that that $1,000 now belongs to me, or that it never existed in the first place, they wouldn't like that at all. They want absolute truth in one area of life,
right?
Even if they don't want it in every area of life.
I think that's what's behind a lot of the undermining of the concept of truth, is that, truth becomes a narrative, so then it truly does become about power, right? Whose truth wins, and your truth ends up being quite inconvenient. It's actually just kind of fascinating to think about the moral aspects of math.
Yes.
Really, like everything else, it's made by God. It has a moral quality too.
It does. It does.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. We're teaching pre-algebra, algebra 1, and geometry this fall, so hurry up and register, y'all. And as we say goodbye to everyone, Lori, we should stay on the line, and we'll hang out a little bit afterwards.
Okay.
Joshua says that Nancy Piercy in Saving Leonardo. Oh, she's the one.
Oh, yes, that's where the 2 levels is. That's where it's coming from.
He's got your back.
Yeah. He should.
Yeah, he should. Well, thank you so much again, and goodbye, everyone.
All right, thank you, and it was lovely to be here. Thanks, Jeffrey. Appreciate it.